Welcome to Mr. Phantom, where fear hides in every shadow and chilling tales come to life. Tonight, we have a story that will send a chill down your spine and leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the world around you. But before we start, make sure to subscribe and like this video to get a scary story every night. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Tonight's tale is called The Basement in Boston. It's a story about a place hidden beneath the floors of an old apartment building in South End, Boston. A place where things are never what they seem, and where the line between the living and the dead becomes disturbingly thin. Our protagonist, someone much like you or I, moves into a new apartment, eager to start fresh. But something is off about the building, something unexplainable that pulls them in deeper, into a mystery that stretches beyond time, space, and reality itself. There are warnings, there are strange occurrences, but curiosity always gets the best of us, doesn't it? And when that curiosity leads them down into the basement, a place that's meant to remain closed, the truth they find might be more horrifying than they could have ever imagined. So sit back, turn off the lights, and get ready for a nightmarish journey into the heart of fear. Because tonight, we step into the dark corners of Boston, where not everything down there is what it seems, and some things should never be uncovered. Let's begin. I remember the first time I saw the apartment. It was in the South End of Boston, a neighborhood with old streets that felt as if they had witnessed 1,000 stories. Some forgotten, some whispered among the bricks and the iron railings. The building itself was a massive, crumbling Victorian structure. One of those buildings that had seen better days but still stood tall, towering over the smaller, more modern buildings around it. I had always been drawn to places like this, quiet, old, with character. Moving into the apartment was an impulsive decision. The rent was reasonable, and the place was spacious. The kind of space that allowed you to breathe, to think, to feel at ease. But something about it felt wrong from the start. I ignored it, of course. New beginnings come with strange feelings. A change in scenery, in life. These things always stir up discomfort at first. I figured I'd get used to it. My neighbors were few and far between, which was exactly what I wanted. I didn't want to be around a lot of people. I worked from home, so peace and solitude were essential for me. There was the sound of footsteps occasionally on the stairwells, but aside from that, the building felt like it was made of whispers. Then there was Mr. Holloway. I didn't meet him right away. At first, he was just a name I saw on the tenant list. The landlord had mentioned him briefly when I moved in. Mr. Holloway lives in the unit upstairs, she'd said. He's an older man, been here for years. Doesn't come out much though. Keeps to himself. Very private. I didn't think much of it. Old people, I thought, tend to keep to themselves. But it wasn't long before I encountered him. One afternoon, as I was carrying a box of books into my apartment, I saw him for the first time in the hallway. He was short and hunched over, with a walking cane that seemed more like a prop than something he genuinely needed. His gray hair was thinning, and his face was covered with deep lines, as though the world had been too heavy on him for too long. His eyes were sharp, though piercing and intense, as if he could look right through you and see the very core of who you were. He nodded at me as I passed by, and I managed a polite smile. "Good afternoon," I said, trying to be friendly. His response was a raspy, almost inaudible whisper. "Don't go into the basement at night." I paused, slightly confused. "What?" He didn't repeat himself, but his eyes widened for just a second, and his voice lowered even more. "Don't open that door after dark. There's things down there, things you don't want to see." His words were strange, cryptic, and they felt out of place. You'd be better off leaving that basement alone. Trust me." I stared at him, unsure of how to respond. My instinct was to laugh it off, to brush it off as the ramblings of an old man. People like Mr. Holloway were often full of strange, paranoid warnings. It's the way they saw the world, full of dangers lurking in places they had no power to control anymore. "Thanks for the advice," I said, though I didn't believe a word of it. He watched me closely as I stepped into my apartment and shut the door. That was the last I saw of him for a while. The building was silent after that, almost oppressively so. I started to notice little things I didn't pay attention to at first. There was a strange draft near the door to the basement. Every time I passed by it, I could feel the cold air seeping through the cracks. And there was a faint creaking sound that came from below, deep in the belly of the building. The kind of sound you hear when a house settles, but it was more than that. It was as if something, or someone, was moving down there. Curiosity began to nibble at me. I tried to ignore it at first. The warnings of Mr. Holloway played in the back of my mind, but I pushed them aside. What could possibly be down there? It was just a basement, right? Probably full of old junk. I wasn't about to let the ramblings of a paranoid old man control my actions. It was a place of mystery, yes, but it was also just part of the building. I figured I was being ridiculous. But then one night, around midnight, I couldn't shake the feeling. I was lying in bed, unable to sleep. The silence was so deep, so absolute, that it felt unnatural. That's when I heard it, a soft, distant sound, like the creak of a door opening. A sound I hadn't noticed before, but it was unmistakable now. A slow, deliberate movement from below. At first, I thought it might just be the house settling. But then the sound came again, this time louder. It was a slow, dragging sound, like something or someone was walking across the floor of the basement. I sat up in bed, listening closely. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. My heart was pounding in my chest. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself it was nothing. But the sound continued, growing more distinct with each passing minute. I couldn't take it anymore. I got up, slipped on my slippers, and walked to the door that led to the basement. The wooden floor creaked beneath my feet as I approached. The door stood there, staring at me. My hand hovered over the handle, a sudden surge of adrenaline rushing through my veins. What if Mr. Holloway was right? What if there was something down there? I hadn't been down there since I moved in, but it was strange. Why hadn't I heard anything until now? The curiosity gnawed at me. It was overwhelming. I turned the handle and opened the door just a crack, just enough to peer into the darkness. The faint light from the hallway illuminated only a small portion of the steps leading down. The rest was lost in shadows. I stepped closer, but before I could move any further, a voice echoed from behind me. "I told you." It was Mr. Holloway. He was standing there in the hallway, just outside my door. His eyes were wide, his face pale. He was staring directly at me. "You shouldn't have opened that door," he said, his voice trembling. "There are things down there, things that shouldn't be disturbed." I froze, my heart sinking. His presence was almost suffocating, like a warning from someone who had seen too much. I started, but the words caught in my throat. "Listen to me," he urged. "Whatever you hear, whatever you see, do not go down there." I didn't listen either, and look where I am now. I could barely process his words. The warning was clear, but so were the questions racing through my mind. What was he talking about? What had happened in that basement? But before I could ask another question, Mr. Holloway turned and shuffled away down the hall, disappearing into the darkness of his own apartment. I stood there, staring at the open door to the basement, the weight of his words hanging in the air. What was it that he knew? What had he seen? And why was it so hard to ignore the nagging pull of curiosity that urged me to go down there, to find out for myself? I didn't know the answers, but I knew one thing for sure. There was something wrong with this building, something wrong with that basement. And I wasn't sure if I was ready to find out what. The days that followed Mr. Holloway's warning were strange, unsettling. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in the building. Maybe it was just paranoia. After all, I had only been living there for a short while, but something about it felt off. It wasn't just the basement, it was the air in the building, the silence that stretched out longer than normal. I'd spent enough time in old places to know they came with a certain kind of ambience, creaks, groans, and whispers of their past, but this felt different, like the building was hiding something. I tried to push it out of my mind. I had work to do, a life to get on with, and indulging in these silly fears wasn't going to get me anywhere. But as the nights went on, I couldn't help but notice things that seemed to confirm my growing sense of unease. The walls seemed thinner than they had the day I moved in. I could hear the faint hum of something moving in the building at night, almost like a vibration in the air. And the floor creaked in ways I had never heard before. I found myself pacing at night, lying in bed with my eyes wide open, listening to every sound. And the sound of those footsteps, those slow, deliberate steps that I had dismissed the first time, came back. Only now they were louder, closer, more distinct. I would hear them in the hallway, echoing softly through the walls. But when I checked the hall, it was always empty. The strange thing was the sounds were rhythmic, timed, almost purposeful, not random at all. It was around the third night after my conversation with Mr. Holloway that I heard the noises again. This time they were louder, more insistent. I felt a strange pull to get up and follow the sounds. There was no rational reason for it. I knew it wasn't normal, but my curiosity outweighed everything else. I slipped out of bed, moved quietly to the hallway, and stared down the long, dark corridor toward the door to the basement. The building was dark, and the only light was coming from the faint glow of the streetlights outside, filtering through the windows. The rest of the place was pitch black. No one was awake. No sounds. Just that creeping, constant sense of something wrong. As I approached the basement door, I couldn't help but feel a cold chill creeping down my spine. It wasn't just a physical coldness either. It felt like something was reaching out from beyond the door, tugging at me, urging me to come closer. I swallowed hard. Mr. Holloway's warning echoed in my head. There are things down there, things you don't want to see. But still, I reached for the handle. My heart was racing now, and I could feel the sweat gathering on the back of my neck. I had never been this afraid before, but I couldn't stop myself. The door creaked open, just a crack, and I stood there for a moment listening. I waited for the sounds to come again, the ones that had drawn me in. But it was silent. The air that rushed up from the basement was damp, thick with an almost musty smell. It reminded me of old, forgotten places, like the scent of decay. It made me shudder, but I ignored it. I was already in too deep now. There was no turning back. I stepped inside. The light in the hallway barely reached the first few steps of the basement stairs. The wooden steps groaned under my feet as I moved cautiously down. With each step, I could feel the air growing colder, denser. I couldn't explain it, but it was as though the space around me was thickening with every inch I descended. The darkness below seemed to close in on me, swallowing up everything. When I reached the bottom, I paused. The basement was vast, far larger than I had imagined. It stretched out before me like a maze, with shelves and boxes stacked high, some of them so old they were covered in layers of dust. The concrete walls were cracked and stained with age. The floor was uneven, and there were pipes running along the ceiling that looked as though they were barely holding up. The air was thick with moisture, and the faint scent of mildew lingered in the corners. I could hear the faint sound again, the same dragging noise. It came from somewhere deep within the basement, echoing off the stone walls. I turned, trying to locate the source, but all I could see was the darkness stretching out ahead of me. There were no lights, and the only illumination was the soft glow from my phone. I pulled it out, shining the flashlight ahead, and the beam flickered as it bounced off the crates and boxes around me. For a moment, I thought I saw something move in the corner of my eye. A shadow darting across the far wall, just out of sight. My heart skipped a beat. I swallowed, trying to steady my nerves. It was nothing. It had to be nothing. But then I heard it again, a soft thud. A heavy, deliberate step. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. There was definitely something down here. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, and it was getting closer. I took a few more cautious steps, my feet almost silent on the concrete floor. My phone's light trembled in my hand as I moved forward, casting long, erratic shadows along the walls. I passed a set of old wooden crates stacked in a corner, and as I neared them, the thudding grew louder. It was unmistakable now. Someone or something was walking toward me. Then, in the dim light, I saw something. A figure. It was standing in the middle of the room, just beyond the reach of my phone's light. It was tall, too tall, and its shape seemed to melt into the darkness around it. It was unnaturally still, and for a moment, I wondered if I was imagining it. My heart pounded so loudly in my chest that I could barely hear the sound of my own thoughts. I took a step back, and in the silence that followed, I could hear the creaking of the floorboards behind me. Another figure? I turned quickly, my flashlight now darting over the walls, desperately trying to find the source of the sound. But there was nothing there, just shadows stretching and warping. A cold shiver ran through my spine as I slowly turned back toward the figure. It had moved closer, barely an inch, but it was enough to send a surge of panic through me. I felt trapped, cornered, like the walls themselves were closing in. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out of the basement, but my legs wouldn't move. Then, in a voice as cold and distant as the grave, a whisper echoed in the darkness. "Get out." It wasn't Mr. Holloway's voice, but it was unmistakably human. Low, guttural, and full of a strange, ancient weight. The voice seemed to surround me, pressing in from all sides. The darkness deepened, and I felt my chest tighten as the temperature in the basement seemed to plummet even further. "Leave now." The voice came again, this time with a sense of urgency. Suddenly, the shadows seemed to move. They stretched, elongated, and seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The figure in the corner of the basement stepped forward, and I caught a glimpse of something. A face, but it was twisted, distorted, unrecognizable. It wasn't human anymore. Panic surged through me. I turned and bolted for the stairs. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. My feet flew up the stairs, faster than I thought was possible, and the darkness seemed to reach up behind me, grabbing at my ankles. When I reached the top, I slammed the door shut behind me, gasping for air. I stood there for a moment, leaning against the door, my heart racing in my chest. I had barely stepped into the hallway when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps once more, this time coming from behind me. But when I turned, there was no one there. And as I stumbled back to my apartment, my mind raced. What had I just seen? What was down there? And why did it feel like the entire building was watching me? I slammed the door to my apartment shut, my hands shaking uncontrollably. But the questions lingered, and I knew deep down I couldn't ignore them. I had to find out what was really in that basement. And in the pit of my stomach, I felt a creeping dread. Something told me that my curiosity had already led me too far. The night after I had fled the basement, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned in bed, my mind replaying every second of what I had witnessed in the shadows below. My heart would race whenever I closed my eyes, and each time I tried to drift into sleep, the sound of the mysterious footsteps echoed through my mind, relentless and unsettling. What had I seen? Was it a trick of the light? Had I imagined it? The questions gnawed at me like a persistent itch, impossible to scratch. But something deeper inside me, something primal and terrified, was also telling me that it wasn't just a figment of my imagination. There was something down there, something in the basement, something that shouldn't have been. I tried to convince myself that I was just tired, that my nerves had gotten the best of me. After all, I had only been living in the building for a week. I didn't know the history of the place, the things that had happened there before I moved in. It could have been anything: creaky pipes, the building settling, maybe even an old rat or two scurrying around. It had to be, right? But deep down I knew better. I thought back to Mr. Holloway's warning, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. "Don't go down there," he had said. "There are things down there, things you don't want to see." His words haunted me, like a shadow I couldn't escape. It wasn't the warning itself that troubled me, though. It was the way he had said it. There had been fear in his voice, a fear that went beyond the ordinary, beyond a mere cautionary tale. I couldn't shake the thought that Mr. Holloway knew something dark and sinister, and I had to know what it was. I didn't want to go back to the basement, not after what I'd seen, but my curiosity was too powerful. It was like a force pulling me, like a magnetic field that drew me toward the very thing I feared. The next night, around midnight, I found myself standing in front of the basement door again. The apartment was silent. The creaks and groans of the old building had faded into the background. Even the wind outside had stilled, as though the world itself was holding its breath. I stood there for a long time, my hand on the cold, brass handle, hesitating. I could turn around, go back to bed, and pretend like none of this had ever happened. I could leave the past 2 nights behind me and forget about it. But I knew I couldn't. The basement, the darkness below, it was calling to me, and I had no choice but to answer. I took a deep breath and turned the handle, opening the door slowly. The familiar cold draft greeted me, swirling up from the depths of the basement. The air smelled musty and damp, the scent of decay mingling with the dust that had settled over the years. I stepped into the darkness, my phone light cutting through the blackness ahead of me. The first step creaked under my weight, the sound echoing through the silence like a warning. I hesitated, then took another step, and another. The stairs seemed to stretch on forever, and the further down I went, the heavier the air became. The temperature dropped, and I could feel the weight of the basement pressing in on me, closing in around me like a vice. I had reached the bottom before I realized it, standing in the center of the basement once more. The walls stretched out in every direction, filled with old boxes, crates, and forgotten things. The shadows seemed to move on their own, twisting and shifting in ways that made my skin crawl. I could hear my breath, shallow and quick, but everything else was silent. No footsteps, no creaking, just an eerie stillness. But then I heard it, a faint sound, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable, a soft scraping noise, like nails against wood. I froze. It was coming from behind me, from the farthest corner of the basement. My heart began to pound in my chest, and I spun around, shining my phone's light toward the sound. For a moment, there was nothing, just the piles of old junk, the dust, and the shadows. Then I saw it, A figure, standing just beyond the reach of the light. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and its body seemed to flicker in the darkness, as though it was barely there, a shadow among shadows. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it wasn't just the shape of the figure that made it terrifying. It was the fact that it seemed to move ever so slightly, as though it were shifting in and out of existence. I took a step back, my pulse racing. My hands were trembling, and I could feel the sweat beading on the back of my neck. The figure didn't move toward me, but I could feel its presence. It was watching me, waiting, and I couldn't take my eyes off it. I took another step backward, and that's when I heard the voice. Low, deep, cold. Why are you here? It wasn't Mr. Holloway's voice. It wasn't even human. The voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, vibrating through the walls, the floor, the air around me. It made my skin crawl. It was the voice of something ancient, something that had been here long before I had arrived, long before anyone had ever set foot in this building. I opened my mouth to speak, but my throat was dry, and no words came out. The figure took a slow step forward, its form becoming clearer in the faint light. It wasn't human, not anymore. Its body was contorted, twisted, and its face, if it could be called a face, was a grotesque mask of shadows and shifting shapes. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were hollow, black pits that seemed to pull in the light, absorbing it. I felt like I was suffocating, like the air around me was thickening, pressing in on me. The figure reached out, its hand elongating, stretching toward me. It was a blur of darkness, a form that didn't belong in this world, in this place. I wanted to run, to scream, but my body wouldn't obey. My legs felt like lead, my feet rooted to the spot. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. All I could do was stare as the figure drew closer, its twisted form becoming more solid with each passing second. Leave now, the voice whispered, and this time I could feel the words in my bones. They were a command, a warning, a plea. It took another step forward, and the air around me became suffocating. My heart was pounding so loudly in my chest that I thought it would burst. The darkness seemed to close in around me, and for a moment, I thought I might lose my mind. And then, as if the figure had read my thoughts, it stopped. It didn't advance any further. It simply stood there, watching me with its black, hollow eyes. I could feel the weight of its gaze on me, heavy and suffocating, but somehow, in the silence that followed, I found the strength to move. I took one hesitant step back, then another, and another. I turned and ran, my heart racing in my chest. I didn't dare look back. I didn't want to know if it was following me, if it was still there, watching, waiting. I raced up the stairs, my legs nearly giving out beneath me. I reached the door, slammed it open, and stumbled into the hallway. I could hear my breath, ragged and harsh, and the pounding of my heart in my ears. I slammed the basement door shut behind me, pressing my back against it, as if that could somehow keep whatever I had seen contained. My body was shaking, my mind a jumble of disbelief and terror. I didn't know what it was that I had seen in that basement, but I knew one thing for certain. Whatever it was not of this world, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep running from it. The days after my second descent into the basement felt like a blur. My mind was a whirlwind of confusion, fear, and disbelief. I couldn't tell anyone what I'd seen, not that I wanted to anyway. I knew that if I spoke of it, they would look at me like I was losing my grip on reality, or worse, that I was already too deep into the grip of whatever strange force was pulling at me. I had to make sense of it. I had to know what was happening. But every time I tried to sleep, every time I closed my eyes, the image of that figure, tall, dark, and twisted, filled my mind. Its black, hollow eyes were burned into my memory, its voice echoing through the corridors of my mind like a curse. I couldn't get rid of it. I couldn't forget. The rest of the apartment building seemed to carry on as normal. The neighbors moved about their daily lives, oblivious to the growing darkness beneath their feet. Mr. Holloway hadn't spoken to me since that night he warned me. He didn't knock on my door, didn't check in like he did when I first moved in. It was as if he had retreated into his own world, content to watch the shadows grow darker without ever speaking of them again. But it was no longer enough to just live in the building. I had to confront it. I had to go back to the basement. I couldn't leave it alone. And so, on the fourth night after my second encounter, I made up my mind. I had to face whatever was lurking down there. I couldn't live with the fear anymore. I had to know the truth. As the hours ticked closer to midnight, I stood in front of the basement door once more. The air in the hallway was thick with anticipation, and the weight of the decision pressed down on me. The building seemed still, almost too still, as though it were holding its breath. Even the streetlights outside cast an eerie glow through the windows, as though they were waiting for something to happen. I took a deep breath and turned the handle. The cold air from the basement rushed up to meet me, but this time I wasn't afraid. Not in the same way, anyway. It was more of a quiet determination than fear now. I had to find out what was down there, even if it meant facing whatever darkness lay within. The basement stairs groaned under my weight as I descended, each step feeling heavier than the last. The darkness below seemed to swallow me whole as I moved deeper into its depths. The cold, musty air clung to my skin, and the silence was so thick I could almost taste it. The further I went, the more the weight of the space pressed in around me, like the very walls were alive, breathing, watching. I reached the bottom and paused. The same old basement, filled with dusty crates and forgotten things. Nothing had changed, or at least nothing that I could see. But something felt different this time. The air felt thicker, heavier, as though the shadows themselves were alive, watching me, waiting for me to make my next move. I stood there, my heart pounding, listening. The footsteps, the ones I had heard before, were gone. There was no dragging sound, no heavy steps in the distance. The silence seemed almost oppressive. My phone's flashlight trembled in my hand as I swept the beam across the room. But there was nothing. No figures. No strange shapes lurking in the corners. And yet I felt it. That unmistakable sense of being watched, of being drawn into something far deeper than I had ever intended. I stepped forward cautiously. Each step felt deliberate, as if the ground beneath me might give way at any moment. I didn't know what I was looking for exactly, but my gut told me I had to go further, to explore the corners of this cursed space until I found whatever it was that had been hidden for so long. I moved to the back corner of the basement, past the piles of old boxes and crates. There, tucked behind a stack of heavy furniture, I saw it, an old weathered door. It wasn't the door to the basement proper, but a smaller, nondescript door tucked out of sight, almost like it had been deliberately hidden. I couldn't explain why, but I knew this was it. This was the door I had to open. I reached for the handle, my hand trembling as I turned it. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a narrow, dimly lit hallway beyond. The air in the hallway was different, thicker, colder, and as soon as I stepped inside, I felt the familiar sense of being drawn in, like something was pulling me toward whatever lay at the end. I hesitated. I had come this far, but I knew that whatever was ahead would change everything. I could turn back now, forget all of this, and live my life in peace. But the curiosity gnawed at me, and I felt the compulsion to keep going, to find the answers to the questions that had been plaguing me. So, I took a deep breath and moved forward. The hallway was narrow, with peeling wallpaper and old, rusted pipes running along the ceiling. The light from my phone flickered, casting long, jittery shadows along the walls. It felt like an entirely different world down here, like I had crossed into something ancient, something forgotten. The further I walked, the more the air seemed to thicken, and the whispers returned, soft at first like a distant murmur, but gradually growing louder, more insistent. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew they weren't meant for me. They were meant for something else. Something or someone else. As I approached the end of the hallway, I saw it. The door. It was smaller than the others, weathered and worn, but there was something about it that sent a chill down my spine. It was as if it had been waiting for me, just like the rest of the building had. And I could feel it, the pull, the magnetic force that had been drawing me deeper into this darkness. I reached for the handle, my heart thudding in my chest. This was it. I was about to see what had been hidden here all these years. The door opened with a groan, revealing a dimly lit room beyond. At first, I couldn't see anything clearly. The shadows seemed to swallow the edges of the room, and the air was thick, heavy with the scent of decay. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw them. Photographs. Hundreds of them. They covered the walls, the floor, the shelves. Photographs of families, of people I didn't know, of people I had never seen before. But what struck me, the thing that made my blood run cold, was the one in the center of the room. It was a photograph of me. I stood frozen, staring at the image of myself, smiling carefree, standing in front of an old, familiar house I had lived in as a child. But it wasn't the photo itself that made my stomach twist. It was the details in the background, the faint shape of a figure, dark and indistinct, lurking behind me. A shadow, a presence that looked too familiar. And then I saw it, the chair. I froze. My blood ran cold. There, in the center of the room, was a single chair, old, wooden, and stained, strapped with leather restraints. I could hear my own breath in the silence, the only sound in the room. There, in the corner of the room, was another photograph. A photograph of me, tied to that same chair, my body twisted, my eyes wide with fear, with something I couldn't quite place. But the most chilling thing of all, the figure in the photograph was not just behind me. It was me. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the temperature dropped even further. I felt a coldness deep within me, cold that wasn't just from the air, but from deep in my bones. I turned, and that's when I saw it. The same figure I had encountered in the basement stood before me, its black, hollow eyes locked onto mine. But this time, there was no hiding, no turning back. "You shouldn't have come here," it whispered, its voice a deep, guttural growl. And in that instant, everything clicked. The truth I had been running from all this time. The truth I had refused to see. This place wasn't just a basement. It was a prison, a place where time twisted, where shadows stretched beyond the walls of reality. A place where people like me, like the ones in the photographs, had been drawn, lured, and trapped. And the worst part, I wasn't just a visitor. I was part of it, a part of something much darker than I had ever imagined. As the figure reached out for me, I realized with a sickening certainty that this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. As the figure advanced toward me, the reality of my situation set in with a horrifying clarity. I wasn't just lost in some old, forgotten building. I wasn't just exploring some hidden space beneath the floorboards of a crumbling apartment. No, this place, this basement, this prison had been waiting for me. Waiting for me. I wanted to scream, to fight back, to run. But the air was thick, suffocating, and my body refused to obey. I couldn't even move as the figure drew closer, its black, hollow eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my heart throb painfully in my chest. I was trapped in a cycle of terror that I couldn't escape, bound to this dark, cursed place that seemed to stretch on for eternity. The whispers grew louder, the voices of the other lost souls who had been pulled here over the years, and I realized with sickening certainty that I wasn't alone. They were all around me, their presence a heavy weight that pressed down from all directions. The figures in the photographs, the memories of past victims, all of them were part of this web, this dark, endless trap. The figure reached out, its hands stretching, skeletal and long. I could feel its coldness, the chill that seemed to emanate from the depths of the earth itself. Just as it touched my skin, a blinding flash of light filled the room, and everything went black. I woke up in my apartment, gasping for air, drenched in sweat. But as my eyes flickered open, I realized nothing had changed. I was back in my room. The walls, the door, everything was just as it had been. I wasn't sure what had happened, whether it had all been a nightmare, a hallucination, or something far worse. But one thing was for certain. The basement wasn't done with me. Not yet. The darkness was still there, waiting. And it would always be waiting. I had just moved into the downtown Chicago apartment a few weeks ago. It was one of those tall, old buildings that had seen better days, but its location made it hard to pass up. I was living alone, a solitary figure in a city that never truly slept. The hustle and bustle of Chicago's streets were familiar to me, but in my apartment, it felt like I could hear only silence. That's the kind of place it was, quiet, even though it was surrounded by the life of the city. The kind of quiet that seemed to press down on you, leaving you with your thoughts and a sense of being alone with the weight of the world. I'm Rio, 33, with a job in finance that keeps me at my desk far too often. I wasn't a social butterfly, never had been. When I moved here, I was more focused on my career than anything else. I didn't even pay much attention to the other residents. I didn't really need to. My apartment was small but cozy, with a view of the street below, where the lights never seemed to go out. I could hear the sound of traffic below, the distant hum of sirens, the occasional honking of car horns. It was all so familiar to me, just background noise that made me feel less alone in this massive city. The building itself had a certain character. The halls were dimly lit, the walls adorned with faded wallpaper that had started to peel off in places. You could smell the age of the building in the air, dusty, musky, a little bit of mildew that you didn't quite notice unless you were paying attention. I'd never been one to dwell on the details. I was too busy with work. The first few days went by quickly. I barely had time to settle in before the daily grind of my job pulled me away. But in the quiet moments, when I would come home in the evening, take off my shoes and collapse onto the couch, I started to feel something strange. It wasn't obvious at first, but it was there, a nagging sensation that something wasn't quite right. At night, when I lay in bed, ready to fall asleep, I began to notice the sound of the building settling. It wasn't unusual for old buildings to make noises. The creaking of wood, the faint thrum of plumbing, the gentle groan of steel beams. But there was something different about this sound, something unsettling. It was like the apartment itself was alive, whispering, calling out. I tried to ignore it. I tell myself it was just the building, just the pipes, just the wind. Anything to convince myself it was nothing. But then, the sound started becoming more frequent. The first night I heard it, I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I had just finished a long day of work, and exhaustion was starting to weigh heavily on me. I rolled over, intending to fall into a deep, peaceful sleep. But just as I closed my eyes, I heard it. A faint sound, like someone screaming. I shot up in bed, heart pounding in my chest. I strained to listen, but it was gone. The apartment was silent once again, as though nothing had happened. I brushed it off, thinking it was some noise from outside, or maybe the building's pipes acting up. Chicago was known for its unpredictable weather, and the wind could make strange noises when it blew through the vents. I lay back down, trying to calm my racing thoughts. But just as I was drifting off again, I heard it once more. This time, it wasn't just a scream. It was a cry, a low, guttural sound that seemed to rise from deep within the walls. My skin prickled with the sensation that I wasn't alone. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I sat up, wide-eyed, listening intently. The noise didn't come again. Instead, there was a strange rustling sound, followed by a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. It wasn't a word I could make out, but the tone was unmistakable, desperate, pleading, as if someone was trying to communicate with me from behind the walls. I could feel my heart race. I felt trapped. I got up, pacing around my small apartment. I checked the windows, the doors. Everything was locked. Everything was as it should be. The silence returned, but the unease lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The whole room felt suffocating, like the air had thickened. I tried to dismiss it as stress, but as I lay back down, I couldn't help but feel that this wasn't just a figment of my imagination. The building was old. Old things had a way of holding on to memories, didn't they? Maybe this was just one of those places where the past had a way of lingering. The next few days passed, and I pushed the weird noises out of my mind. But that's the thing about silence. It only feels comforting for so long before it starts to feel oppressive. And then, just when I thought I had forgotten about it, the sounds came back. Only this time they were louder. I was lying on the couch one evening after work, scrolling through my phone when I heard it again. The same high-pitched scream, the same guttural cry, followed by the whisper. It was almost like the sound was coming from within the walls, or worse, the vents. My eyes widened as the reality of it hit me. The vents. I hadn't noticed before, but now I could hear the unmistakable sound of someone, scraping against the metal. I froze. Was someone in the building? Was there someone trying to get my attention? My first instinct was to call the building manager. But what would I say? Hey, I think there's someone stuck in the walls, trying to talk to me. I didn't even believe it myself. But the longer I listened, the more certain I became that this was no accident, no random noise. I grabbed my phone and dialed the building's emergency number, my hands trembling slightly. The manager picked up on the second ring. "Hello." "Hi," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm in apartment 23B. I think there's something wrong with the ventilation system. I keep hearing these weird noises, like screams, cries, and whispers. It's been going on for a few days now." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "It's probably just the old pipes," the manager replied finally. His voice was dismissive, like he had heard complaints like mine before. "These old buildings make all sorts of noises. Don't worry about it." I opened my mouth to argue, but he had already hung up. He didn't even give me a chance to explain. I stared at the phone, frustration bubbling up inside me. Was I really imagining things? But the sounds, those horrible, desperate sounds, were too real to be a figment of my imagination. And I was beginning to feel like I wasn't the only one here. Something was in the apartment with me. Something I couldn't see. That night, I lay awake, wide-eyed and restless. The sounds had stopped for the moment, but I knew it wouldn't last. And when they came back, and I knew they would. I didn't know if I'd be able to ignore them anymore. The silence was thick, but it wasn't comforting. It was the kind of silence that only made the noises seem louder when they inevitably returned. And they would return. I just didn't know yet how much worse it would get. The next few days were a blur. I went through the motions of my everyday life, work, meals, and the occasional stop at the grocery store. But something had shifted inside me. The unease I had been feeling slowly grew into a palpable fear. It clung to me like a shadow that never fully disappeared, and no matter how much I tried to distract myself with work or the noise of the city, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The sound started again that night. It was subtle at first, just a soft scraping sound that could have easily been mistaken for a settling pipe or the hum of an old air conditioning unit. But this time it was different. It wasn't just the walls creaking or the pipes groaning. No, this time it was more deliberate, more insistent. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore the building's noises as they echoed around me. But then I heard it, the soft scrape of metal against metal, followed by a low, gurgling whisper. It was muffled, as though it was coming from somewhere far away, but it was clear enough that it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Aya, help me." I froze. The voice wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. It was a woman's voice, weak and desperate. It wasn't a normal sound at all. It wasn't a sound that could come from the vents or the pipes. It was a voice alive and terrified. The kind of voice you'd hear if someone was trapped, struggling for air. I jumped out of bed and rushed to the vent near my bedroom window. It was old, a dusty metal cover with jagged edges, and when I pressed my ear to it, I could feel a slight vibration, like something was trying to get out. My pulse hammered in my ears. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was rooted to the spot, unable to tear myself away. The whispering continued. "I'm in here. Help me." A cold chill washed over me. My breath hitched in my throat. This wasn't normal. I had lived in old buildings before, and I knew how they could make strange noises. But this was something else. Something far beyond any logical explanation. I turned around quickly, checking every corner of the apartment, half expecting someone to be standing there in the dark, watching me. The shadows in the room seemed to shift and move, but I knew that was just my mind playing tricks on me. I had to stay calm. I had to. I grabbed my phone and dialed the building manager again. The line rang for what seemed like an eternity before he picked up, sounding groggy and irritated. "Hello. Hey, it's Rio from 23B again. I need to talk to you about those noises." "They're getting worse," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, but I could hear the tremor in it. The manager sighed heavily on the other end of the line. "I told you before, it's just the pipes. Old buildings do that sometimes. There's nothing to worry about." "No," I pressed. "This is different. It's a voice. I hear someone crying for help. It's not just pipes or wind. Please, you need to come and check it out." There was a long pause. I could hear him breathing, probably considering whether to take me seriously or not. Finally, he spoke. "Look, I don't know what to tell you. Maybe you're just hearing things. If it's really bothering you, I'll send someone over tomorrow to check the pipes again. But honestly, I think you're overreacting. It's an old building." I felt a surge of frustration. "No, I'm not overreacting. There's something here, and I don't think it's just the building. Please just come check. I'm not making this up." But the manager had already hung up before I could say anything else. I stared at the phone in my hand, my heart pounding in my chest. He didn't believe me. Of course he didn't. Why would he? He probably thought I was just another overworked, stressed out tenant who had watched one too many horror movies. I almost wished that was all this was, an overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The voice I'd heard, it wasn't something I could explain away. And it had said something I couldn't ignore. It had said, "Help me." I couldn't just let it go. That night, the whispers grew louder. They no longer sounded like muffled voices through a wall or vent. Now they were more distinct. They were closer, and they were more desperate. "I'm here," the voice whispered. "I'm here with you." I nearly jumped out of my skin. The voice was so clear now, it felt like someone was standing right next to me, whispering in my ear. My breath came in short gasps. I shot up from my bed and turned on every light in the apartment, trying to drown out the sound of that voice, trying to shake off the sense of dread that gripped me. I checked every door, every window, making sure everything was locked. The silence that followed felt suffocating. It was as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. But then, something else caught my attention. A faint noise, like the sound of scratching against wood. It came from behind the walls. No, from inside the walls. I pressed my ear to the cold, rough surface of the wall, holding my breath, straining to hear. It was faint at first, but as I focused, the sound became clearer. It was rhythmic, like something, or someone, was moving through the wall. I jumped back, my mind racing. There was something, someone, in the walls. My heart was hammering in my chest, and for the first time in days, I allowed myself to fully acknowledge the fear that had been creeping up on me. I couldn't explain it. I didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was mounting. The whispers, the scratching, the voice begging for help. I felt as though the apartment was alive in a way I could never have imagined. I wanted to leave. I wanted to run out of there and never come back. But something kept me rooted to the spot. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was the need to understand, but I couldn't bring myself to turn away. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the voice spoke again. This time, more forceful, more urgent. "I'm in the apartment next door. Help me." I staggered back from the wall, my mind reeling. The apartment next door? But it was empty. No one had lived there since I moved in. I had never seen anyone come or go from that unit. I thought it had been abandoned. But the voice had said the apartment next door. And now, it seemed to be calling to me. It was no longer pleading. It was demanding. "Help me," it whispered again. My skin crawled, my mind spinning with confusion and terror. The voice came from that empty apartment next door, but that didn't make sense. The apartment had been vacant for months. No one had lived there. But then I remembered something. A fire that had happened years ago. A fire that had left the entire building charred and ruined. I'd never really looked into it, but I remembered hearing about it from the neighbors when I first moved in. The apartment next door had been a part of that fire. The fire that had killed everyone inside. The voice wasn't just in the walls. It was coming from the apartment next door, the one that had been left untouched since the tragedy, the one that had been locked up, sealed off from the rest of the building, the one that, in that moment, I realized, might not be so empty after all. I was no longer sure if I was dealing with a haunting or something far more sinister. But I knew one thing for sure. Whatever it was not going to leave me alone. The next few days were a blur of sleepless nights and growing paranoia. I found myself caught in a cycle of fear and disbelief, as if my mind was trying to rationalize the unexplainable. The voice, the whispers, the scratching, there was no denying it anymore. They were real. The question was who or what was behind them. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear it again. The voice, the cries for help, the desperate whispering that came from the walls, the vents, the very air itself. It was as if the building had a soul, one that was trapped, one that was begging for something, anything to break the silence. The only problem was, I didn't know if it was a soul in pain or something far darker. I was starting to lose track of time. The days felt like an endless stretch of hours, each one blending into the next. The only thing that marked the passing of time was the relentless pounding in my chest every time I heard that voice. The more I tried to ignore it, the louder it became. The more I tried to tell myself that it was just my imagination, the more real it felt. I couldn't escape it. One afternoon, I decided I couldn't live like this anymore. I had to confront whatever was in that apartment next door. I couldn't just sit here in fear, waiting for something to happen. I had to know the truth. I had to see for myself if what I was hearing was real, or if I was truly losing my mind. So, I went next door. I stood in front of the door to 23C, the apartment next to mine, and stared at it for a long moment. The door was shut tight, just like it always had been. But now it felt different, like it was holding something back. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob, but I didn't pull away. I couldn't. I had to know. I twisted the knob and pushed the door open. The creak of the hinges was unnervingly loud in the silence. The smell that hit me was overwhelming, a musty, stale odor, like something had been left in this apartment for years without being touched. Dust covered every surface, and the furniture, though sparse, was coated in grime. It was like stepping into a time capsule, frozen in place since the fire had ravaged the building years ago. The first thing I noticed was the air. It was thick, almost suffocating. There was a weight to it, a heaviness that seemed to press against my chest with each breath I took. I could feel the presence in the room, like someone, or something, was standing right behind me, watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I stepped further into the apartment, my eyes darting around as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The walls were scarred by the fire, with blackened patches and peeling paint. The windows were covered in thick layers of dust, and the floor creaked beneath my feet. But despite the decay, there was something oddly familiar about it, as though this place was alive, a place that had a history, a story waiting to be told. I walked deeper into the apartment, drawn to the faint, flickering light that came from under a closed door at the far end of the room. It was the only source of light in the entire apartment, and as I approached, I felt a chill run down my spine. My fingers trembled as I reached for the door handle. I had no idea what I expected to find on the other side, but I knew I had to open it. I pushed the door open, and what I saw nearly made my heart stop. The room beyond was small, cramped, and filled with the remnants of a life once lived. But it wasn't the furniture or the decaying wallpaper that caught my attention. It was the mirrors. The entire room was lined with them, large, ornate mirrors that covered every inch of the walls. Some were cracked, some were completely shattered, but all of them reflected the dim light in 1,000 different directions, creating a distorted, nightmarish effect. It was as if the room itself was trying to trap you, to keep you from escaping. In the center of the room was an old, dusty armchair. It looked like something out of a horror movie, worn, frayed, and covered in what looked like old stains. But it was the chair's position that made my blood run cold. It faced the mirrors, as if it had been placed there intentionally, to allow someone to sit and stare at their own reflection, trapped in an endless loop of self-reflection. I took a step forward, my eyes drawn to something strange at the foot of the chair. There on the floor was a small, tattered rug. It had been placed carefully, almost deliberately, over a small indentation in the wood beneath it. I bent down, my curiosity getting the better of me, and lifted the rug. Beneath it was a trapdoor. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the wooden door, its edges worn and weathered. There was something about it that felt wrong, something dark and foreboding. I knelt down, my hands shaking as I reached for the rusty metal handle. I tried to pull it open, but it wouldn't budge. My mind raced with possibilities. Was there something hidden down there? Or was it something far worse? Suddenly, I heard it again. The whisper, "Help me." The voice was faint, but unmistakable. It was the same voice I had been hearing for days, the one that had been calling out to me from the walls. It was coming from beneath the trapdoor. I could feel it deep in my chest, a heavy, oppressive presence that seemed to pulse with every word. I pulled harder on the handle, desperate to open the door. It felt like I was fighting against something that didn't want me to know what was down there. But with a final strained pull, the trapdoor gave way, creaking open slowly. The darkness beneath it seemed to stretch out, almost alive, pulling at me, tempting me to look closer. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, pointing it down into the darkness. The beam of light flickered for a moment before revealing what was hidden below. At first, I couldn't make out much, just darkness. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw it, an old, narrow staircase that descended into a deep, shadowy basement. The walls of the staircase were covered in mold, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. My stomach churned, but I couldn't look away. The whispering voice was growing louder now, more insistent. "Aya, help me come down here." I stood there, frozen at the edge of the trapdoor, the flashlight beam shaking in my hand. My heart was pounding in my chest, but there was no turning back now. I had to find out what was down there. I had to understand what was calling to me, what was tormenting me with these whispers, these cries for help. But as I took my first step toward the staircase, I felt it. A presence. Something cold, something ancient, something that had been waiting for me. I wasn't alone anymore, and I had no idea what I was about to uncover. The first step down into the basement groaned under my weight. Each creak of the old wooden stairs sounded deafening in the thick, suffocating silence. My flashlight beam wobbled with every shaky breath I took. I had descended into darkness before, in dreams, in old buildings, in memories, but this was different. This darkness felt like a presence, like it was watching, waiting. The air grew colder the deeper I went. Not the kind of cold you feel in winter, but the damp, bitter kind that clings to your bones and slows your heartbeat. My skin prickled. The smell of mildew and rot grew stronger, until I was breathing through my mouth just to keep from gagging. I reached the bottom of the stairs and paused. The space opened up into what looked like an unfinished sub-basement. Concrete floors, mold-covered walls, rusted pipes along the ceiling. But what caught my eye, what made me freeze completely, was the wall straight ahead. It was covered in writing. No scratching. Names. Hundreds of them. Carved into the concrete with something sharp, something desperate. Some of the letters were faint, some jagged and deep, overlapping as if someone had tried again and again to be heard, to be remembered. I shined my light closer and traced a trembling finger across one of the names near the bottom. E. Watson. There were more. So many more. Some had dates next to them. And one of them, my breath caught, had my birthday beside it. Avery Castillo, April 11th. My hands began to tremble, my mouth dry as dust. That was my birth date. That was my name. But it couldn't be. This had to be a sick joke. Some twisted urban legend I'd stumbled into. There was no logical explanation for what I was seeing. But deep down, past the panic, past the fear, something in me knew. Something in me remembered. The whisper came again. Rio. It wasn't coming from behind me anymore. It was everywhere. In the walls. in the concrete, in the stale, unmoving air. And then a shape began to form in the far corner of the room. At first, I thought it was a trick of the shadows, my flashlight playing games with my mind. But then it moved. A silhouette, tall and thin, slowly stepped out from the darkness. I stumbled back, hitting the wall behind me. My light caught it fully now, and I wished I hadn't looked. It was a woman, or had once been. Her skin was charred in places. Pieces of her hair melted to her scalp. Her eyes were hollow and weeping, her mouth twisted in an expression of pain I can't even describe. And yet, somehow, I recognized her. She looked familiar. Not like someone I'd met in passing, but someone I knew. Someone I'd loved. Then she spoke. "You promised you'd help me." Her voice echoed through the room like broken glass. My knees buckled. I don't know you," I stammered. "I don't know what this is." She took another step toward me. Her movements were jerky, like a puppet held by invisible strings. "You do know me, Rio. You forgot. You let us burn." The word burn rang in my ears like a scream. And just like that, memories came crashing down like bricks. I saw the fire years ago. The building, the smoke, the chaos. The birthday party. The candles. The scream. I had lived here before. Not in this apartment, not recently, but years ago as a child. I had blocked it out. My family had moved away after the fire. They never spoke of it again. I had convinced myself it wasn't real. But it was. I had been here. On that night. My neighbors hadn't escaped. The girl next door, the one I had played with every day, she hadn't escaped. Her name had been Avery, and I had left her behind. The whispers intensified, rising to a crescendo that rattled the very walls. More figures emerged from the darkness. Burned, broken, whispering. "You left us. You forgot. You ran." I backed up until I hit the staircase, flashlight flickering wildly. I screamed, but it came out strangled. I turned to flee up the stairs, heart pounding, but the steps weren't there anymore. Just an endless drop into blackness. No, 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 I whispered, turning back. But the basement was changing. The mirrors from the upstairs room were appearing on the walls. One by one, they blinked into existence, and in every single one, I saw myself. But not just me. In one, I was staring in horror as flames danced around me. In another, I was younger, banging on a locked door while smoke filled the hallway. And in the one closest to me, I was standing in this basement, staring back at myself. Only in the reflection, I was the one burned. My skin blistered, my clothes scorched, my eyes hollow. I screamed and smashed the mirror with my flashlight, but it did nothing. The glass didn't crack. Instead, my reflection smiled. "We remember, even if you don't," it said in my voice. The room shook. The names on the wall began to glow with an eerie orange light. The temperature spiked, and smoke curled from the corners of the room. I could hear flames again. The fire was back. It was all happening again. I fell to my knees, covering my ears. I didn't mean to. I didn't know. I forgot. But the whispers only grew louder. "She screamed your name, Rio. She thought you'd come back for her." I couldn't take it anymore. "I'm sorry," I shouted. "I'm so sorry." And then, silence. Total, choking silence. When I opened my eyes, I was back in my apartment. On the floor, my flashlight beside me dead. My skin was clammy with sweat, my clothes soaked. The sun was rising outside. Birds chirped like nothing had happened. But something had happened. I sat up slowly, every muscle in my body aching. I looked around. Everything was normal. The vent was closed. The walls were silent. But when I turned toward my front door, I saw it. A mirror, propped against the wall, one I'd never owned, and written across it in the foggy surface, in small, careful letters. Don't forget again. My apartment's lease said 23B. My ID still said my name was Rio Morales. But the mail that came to my door that afternoon had a different name. Avery Castillo. The birthday, April 11th. I stood there, staring at it, staring at the mirror, at my reflection, and for a split second, only a second, I saw her, standing behind me in the mirror, smiling faintly. Then she was gone, but the vent still whispers at night, still calling, not in fear anymore, but in warning, because the voices in the vent never truly leave. They only wait for the next one to forget. And now, as I sit in my apartment every night, I no longer question what's real and what isn't. I know the truth. The voices in the vent, they were never just voices. They were memories, twisted, screaming, trapped between the walls of this building and the cracks of my own mind. Forgotten souls who refused to stay silent. I keep the mirror covered now, draped in an old bedsheet like it's a body I'm trying to bury. I don't dare look into it, not because I'm afraid of what I'll see, but because I already know who's staring back. I've started talking to them sometimes, when the nights stretch too long and the silence becomes too sharp. I whisper into the vent, soft apologies carried through the rusted metal to wherever they wait. I remember, I tell them, and I do. The fire, the screams, the faces I tried to forget, they're all part of me now. Part of this place. Part of her. Avery. She hasn't come back since that morning, but I know she's near, watching, maybe even protecting me, or maybe just waiting to make sure I don't make the same mistake again. People think cities like Chicago are too alive, too loud, too full of motion to hold ghosts. But they're wrong. It's in the stillness, in the narrow alleys, in the humming vents of high-rises, where the dead make their home. So if you ever move into an old apartment, and you hear something whispering your name through the vents, don't answer. Not unless you're ready to remember the things you buried. Because the dead don't forget, and they don't forgive.